So welcome everybody to the last of the series. Always sad, but it's been such a pleasure having Father Tom with us for so many series. They just keep getting better and better, in my opinion, or I'm more receptive. We never know, right? What causes that? But I appreciate his time in preparing the materials. Every time I get the handouts, I think, my goodness, how many hours went into preparing this? So thank you for that. And please join me in welcoming Father Tom once again.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see you. Can you hear me okay? Good. The prayer for the Synod. We stand before you, Holy Spirit, as we gather together in your name. With you alone to guide us, make yourself at home in our hearts. Teach us the way we must go and how we are to pursue it. We are in need of forgiveness and healing. Do not let us promote disorder. Do not let ignorance lead us down the wrong path, nor partiality influence our actions. Let us find in you our unity, so that we may journey together to eternal life, and not stray from the way of truth and what is right. All this we ask of you, who are at work in every place and time and everyone, in communion with the Father and the Son, forever and ever. Amen. Well, the last time we met, I suggested that today we would pay attention to the mystical voice of women through the centuries. But what we decided to do, because there's one more element that I wanted to share with you today, is to make a series out of this. So in the springtime, in March, we'll have a 4-part series on the Mosaic of Catholic thought, women's voice through the centuries. So we'll go back through the same period of time, this time emphasizing the women up to and including our own period of time in the Catholic tradition. Because oftentimes when you look at church history, it's told from the viewpoint of the masculine, or what some people would say patriarchy. And many people get relegated to footnotes or to the devotional literature. It's important for us to see that great community of women through the centuries. Sometimes these women are in deep relationship with the male counterparts, such as Augustine's mother, Monica. And you see that great tradition in the Augustinian tradition, or Clare and Francis, such as you see in the Franciscan tradition. But there are women also through the history who stand in their own right. And those voices must be heard if we were to have an accurate, adequate understanding of Catholic thought through the centuries. And all of this is transformational for our period of time today. Before we go to our final conclusion on St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuit community, and then the great tradition of Jesuit spirituality and theology, I thought it would be good for us to go back and do a little summation of where we've been. I don't know about you, but I forget where I've been, and that's why I get confused about where I'm going, and it helps me to realize where I am. So here's what we have probed in this particular series, and I'm a little bit surprised that we have done so much in a little period of time, and I hope this has been a blessing to you. First of all, we opened our reflections by going back into the ancient community, and we talked about Anthony of the Desert, 251 to 356. We saw that Anthony and people like him we have the desert fathers and the desert mothers, began to go out into the wilderness. Remember, in the great biblical tradition, the wilderness is the place where Israel fell in love with God and God fell in love with Israel. So to this day, there's something about going on the retreat, going up the mountain, going out into the desert, down by the river, to the seashore, in the solitude. That's very, very important. Anthony, of course, was resisting what he sensed was the accommodation of the Christian community to the Roman Empire. Sometimes you get people who love to do that. They love to enculturate. They like to go over the borders. But there's other people who then are seeking the purity. They understand that sometimes in making accommodation, perhaps you compromise too much. But interestingly enough, the three virtues that accompany Anthony and his ilk into the desert community, some of whom formed monasteries and communities, and others lived in solitude and developed the tradition of the hermit. In your life, you might vacillate between the two. Sometimes we want to be with the family, with the community, in the neighborhood. Other times we need to be alone. Maybe the cat can come, maybe the puppy, but we like to be alone. The three virtues that Anthony would emphasize are hospitality, that generosity to the other, quiet, because if you don't calm down and you don't quiet, you might not hear God singing in your heart. And three, humility. Humility is different than humiliation. Humiliation is when you're put down. Humility is when you present yourself with kindness toward the other. When your fundamental understanding is any blessing I have is meant to be shared with generosity. The second person we met was Augustine. St. Augustine with his mother, Monica. The years would be 354 to 430. Augustine, of course, was a North African who is highly intelligent, who goes through a great conversion experience after living licentiously. His mother has the gift of tears. She literally weeps him into salvation. You could say that long before Augustine was baptized in the font, his mother baptized him with her tears. There's a lovely scene where the mother and the son are having a vision of God, a vision of Jesus, and they're having the vision together at the same time in the same place. Augustine, of course, is the one that gives us a theology that's not really in vogue at the moment, the theology that perhaps comes from the viewpoint of original sin, that human beings, by their nature, because of the sin that was committed originally, the original sin, they inherit from their parents, and therefore they live a life of great difficulty. There is a tendency toward sin. Now, you can read that from a philosophical point of view, or you could read it from a psychological point of view, or an autobiographical point of view. Oftentimes, the theology that we have reflects the life that we live. So if Augustine emphasizes sin, it's because Augustine is emphasizing grace. And of course, that great Augustinian monk, Martin Luther, will read Augustine through the eyes of St. Paul. And if we're not careful, we'll read the tradition negatively and see that it's all about sin. And not a few preachers over the years have emphasized it that way. But for Augustine, it was about grace. So much so that in the 17th chapter of the book of Confessions, he writes this: "Late have I loved thee, O beauty so ancient and so new, late have I loved thee. For behold, you were within me, and I was outside. I sought thee outside. In my unloveliness, fell upon those lovely things that you made. You were with me, I was not with you. I tasted you, and now I hunger and thirst for you. You touched me, and I have burned for thy peace." Another person we were concerned with was Saint Benedict, 480 to 574, and his twin sister Scholastica. In many ways, Benedict is called the father of monasticism, even though we can find the monastic community going back to Anthony and maybe even before. Benedict gives us what is called the rule of life. Religious orders, those who live in vowed community, have what we call a rule of life. Benedict wrote the rule of life, which became a standard then in the community. Even though Augustine had one first, Benedict is major breakthrough. Here you have a rule of life that's based on flexibility. And Benedict does a lovely integration of prayer, work, reflection, and study. Here's what he says in his rule of life: "Let them prefer nothing whatever to Christ. May he bring all of us together to life everlasting." So for Benedict, we don't interrupt work to pray, and we don't interrupt prayer to work, and we don't interrupt prayer to study, or work to study, or interrupt study to work. For in everything we do, we are seeking the one who blesses us. We are being directed by the example of Jesus in all things that we do. So the rule doesn't simply provide directives that we must conform to, but signposts along the way. Sometimes I say, I am mopping this floor for my following of Jesus. I am visiting the sick in the hospital for the following of Jesus in everything that we do. Benedict would have us live life with a sense of rhythm, a sense of purpose, a sense of consciousness. He could be pretty fierce, even though his rule says to be flexible and open. It seemed that the one who had the flexibility was Scholastica, who literally prayed to God that Benedict would be set free from his tendency to rigidity. And you can see what happens even in the modern world when you meet somebody who's rigid, and sometimes afraid to change anything. Everything has to be the way it used to be. They don't have a rule of life. They have a compulsion about events. There's a difference between compulsion, conformity, and the rule. The rule is a guidepost along the way that reminds us of the soul's search for Christ. Then in 1181 to 1226, the beloved St. Francis, of course, canonized in the Catholic Church, but literally has been canonized by the peoples of the world. Unfortunately, through the centuries, many have relegated Francis to the man in the bird bath. as opposed to the one who had the essential conversion because he tasted the wounds of a leper, a man with a dreaded skin disease. He strips himself of all earthly possession because Francis recognizes that he's blessed with the glory of God and the majesty of creation. Contrary to Augustine and Augustine's approach to theology, Francis and subsequently the Franciscans emphasized the beauty of creation, the splendor of creation. The way a gospel person might read the New Testament is the way Saint Francis saw the world. Every leaf, every animal, every creature, every drop of water was another verse in that sacred scripture called God's creation. Francis, of course, shows a high degree of ingenuity and creativity. We get from the great Franciscan tradition the way of the cross and the nativity. Just think of that for a moment, the way of the cross and the nativity, and this wonderful sense that the word of God is to be found in every created aspect of the world. The Jesuit, Pope Francis, took his name from Saint Francis. And we see it reflected in his great encyclical Laudato Si, where the risen presence of Christ is imbued in every aspect of the natural world. It's Saint Francis who gave us verses like this: Most high, all powerful, all good Lord, all praise is yours, all glory, all honor, all blessings. To you alone, Most High, do they belong. No mortal lips are worthy to pronounce your name. Praise be you, my Lord, with all the creatures, especially so brother Sun, who is the day through whom you give us light. He is beautiful and radiant with great splendor. Of you, Most High, he bears your likeness. Praise be you, my Lord, through Sister Moon and the stars. In heaven you have made them bright, precious, and fair. Imagine if every time we walked down the street and encountered the beauty of creation, we could break into that song and have that sense that we're not on our way to church. We live in the sanctuary, the cathedral, the majesty of God's presence, called the here and now of creation. The next person we pondered was St. Thomas Aquinas, 1225 to 1274. Thomas, of course, was put by his family in a Benedictine school, but of his own free will escaped and went to the Dominicans. The Dominicans were important to Thomas Aquinas because he wanted to join the order of preachers. He wanted to know what it was like to be with the poor and the broken and the hurting within the world. This is a man of extraordinary intelligence, extraordinary creativity, who probably had an eating disorder, had difficulty perhaps in relationships, and was called the dumb ox. Well, it so happened that the dumb ox theological writings were so inventive and creative at the time that they became the standard for Catholic theology in the West for the next 800 years. And even today, you would not really be studying theology if you did not spend significant time with Thomas Aquinas. His genius was that he was able to take pagan Greek philosophy and fuse it with the Bible, especially the New Testament. This was a monumental breakthrough in creativity. Thomas was able to do what many of us are seeking to do today. How do we integrate science and faith? Modern insights with ancient faith. Thomas operated with what we call a philosophy of realism. Much like in the school of Francis, to pay attention to the divine presence in the order of things. Thomas would emphasize something like the natural law, that human reason, if it applies itself sincerely and honestly, can come to some real truths about the divine in the experience of life as it is. Thomas didn't think that revelation was not necessary. He simply pointed out that revelation was not irrational, that the rational ability of the human being to think, to feel, were essential. I think that if we ever lost the tradition of St. Thomas Aquinas, we might lose our ability to be a thinking person. What do you really think? Here we see the study that Benedict would have us do now goes into the depth of development in Thomas Aquinas. Yet Thomas Aquinas had a profound experience. As he was writing his Summa Theologica, the book that became the series of books that became the standard for Catholic theology, suddenly, in reflecting on the sacrament of penance, he stopped the enterprise in thin air. He said, I can no longer write anymore. Many like to say that the Summa Theologica came to an end because he died, or because he had a breakdown, or because he was sick. I think it's because Thomas Aquinas had a mystical experience. Sometimes when you think about something profoundly, the door of your soul opens, and what you've been seeking is now what you see. And once you see it, there's nothing more to say. You're struck to the core. You see, in all of these saints, they have what we would call a mystical experience, where words fail. Thomas Aquinas prayed this: grant me, O Lord my God, a mind to know you, a heart to seek you, wisdom to find you, conduct pleasing to you, faithful perseverance in waiting for you, and the hope of finally embracing you. Amen. So there's a little summation of where we've been so far. Hopefully all of that is a great blessing to all of us. This is the tradition that came down from us. These are not people saying the same thing. These are people who, up out of their life experience, are sometimes saying very dramatically different things. As a matter of fact, they can be conflicting schools of theology. It is not unheard of that the Dominicans, the Franciscans, the Benedictines, and the Augustinians have to have 4 or 5 different theological schools, all in the Catholic tradition. But here we can see the Catholic tradition is far from a monolith. It is a family of the communities of the ways of thinking and the various pathways of life. Okay, let's stop for a moment, take a deep breath, take all the love that's in your heart and release it to the world. Any thoughts, any feelings, any points of clarification?
I don't see any hands raised or any questions. Good review on where we've been so far.
Yeah.
Diane?
My thing that, kind of crossed my mind is that it seems to me that mankind is continuously on this journey, and that we're on a journey in growing closer to God. And the journey started ages ago and has come down through the ages, through these marvelous saints, and opened up a window, so to speak, and a pathway, or opened a door as a pathway of a deeper understanding of who is God and how our relationship with Jesus leads us to God. And I am kind of seeing that happening today in what's going on in the world. And I think, Father, you had it kind of right when you said that here we're probably in a state where we're trying to reconcile religion with science. And, that's the journey that is taking us now, and probably has been going on for a while now.
Mhm, mhm. That's wonderful. Put a thank you for your summation there. That was very lovely. You can see that, and sometimes you get in the conflict, like Augustine dealing with the fall of the Roman Empire. The first modern person, so to speak. You see Thomas Aquinas dealing with the breakdown of society because of the Great War with the East and the so-called Muslim invaders into the West. There are people who despair, people who deny, people who run away, and then there's people who engage. And what we see in people like Aquinas and Augustine is the engagement. And they see periods of time that other people get depressed over as periods of time rich in creativity. So it's interesting that some of the most creative, inventive theological developments in church history have come in the moments where many people were in despair, wondering if there would be a tomorrow, let alone a future. And so I always get suspicious when people go, isn't it awful? Isn't it awful? Isn't it awful? And I go, yeah, it really is. But if you look at the history of when people said, isn't it awful? Those were the great breakthrough moments in the history of human understanding, religiously, psychologically, socially. So I don't want to wreck anybody's despair, but there's people out there today, and you may be one of them, who are in tune with how awful it is, but don't settle for that. They see the potential in the awfulness and how this could be the moment of breakthrough in creativity. I like to put it this way: breakdown invites breakthrough. The Zen people have a wonderful statement. They say, my barn having burned to the ground, I can now clearly see the moon. The next person I would like to share with you is the Saint Ignatius of Loyola. We're in Spain now. And the year is, you can tell we're getting into the modern period, so we have solidified dates. October the 23rd, 1491 to July 31st, 1556. Right between right after the Protestant Reformation, the Council of Trent, and the discovery, so to speak, of the Americas, except that the people who were already here knew where they were, so they weren't exactly discovered. Ignatius is a fascinating figure, well-to-do, well-off, part of aristocracy. He wanted to be a military person, wanted to be someone of great fame. He could sing, he could dance, He was ingenious in all of the arts by which you become a person who's well off, by which you could use inherited status and inherited wealth for the well-being of yourself. You could say this is truly a person of the world who would be happy with the nightclubs, the courts, the places of high status. And he would do so, first of all, by his engagement in the military and the war with France. France and Spain were in a battle. And of course, Ignatius was part of the army that he was in. In the midst of the hot pursuit of battle and war, he was injured. Jesuits love to tell the story of the cannonball that did him in. He was literally hit with a cannonball that shattered his leg. In the attempt to repair the leg, it was set wrong and had to be rebroken at Ignatius's command. So it was then reset, but even the reset leg was never quite right. And for the rest of his life, he walked with a limp and somewhat in pain. This destroyed his military career. That meant that he would have to spend his time in convalescence and recovery with his career over. This would be a life-changing event. He asked for books. He wanted to read books that reflected on the society of the day, but there weren't any available where he was. All that existed, according to the autobiographical sketches we have from Ignatius, we do have his autobiography. The only books that he could get his hands on were books concerning the devotion to the saints and the lives of the saints. And so I guess when you're confined to your bed and you don't have many options, you settle for whatever options you have. So somewhat reluctantly, perhaps, he started reading the books that he had to pass the time because he couldn't get the books that he wanted. Now, isn't that interesting? To seize what you have, even though you don't necessarily have what you want. And over the weeks of reading about the lives of the saints, Ignatius is impressed. He's touched in his heart. He's so touched in his heart that he begins to pursue something we would call the search for God, or if you would say, the search for the spiritual life. Now, this is a highly creative and inventive man. This is a man whose imagination is vivid, whose creativity is profound, and whose engagement in the world at one time was uncompromising. So there's energies here that he doesn't get rid of. They end up being converted, if you will, to the pathways of the way he would live his life. Let's go back now to his childhood. There's a wonderful summation of his biographical information that begins on page 3 of the notes that you received today. If we go back to his youth, this is what we discover. His mother died at when he was very, very young. But Ignatius had several experiences that were quite negative and painful. He saw contradictions in the way the church behaved. The ideals of the crown, that is the king, his own family life in the church, were less than examples of virtue. His father, for example, was unfaithful in the marriage. Perhaps Ignatius sought to compensate for the hypocrisy in church behavior, for the hypocrisy in the crown, and for the duplicity in his father, by thinking that his own passions needed to be fulfilled. But we see that his quest for glory, by joining the military and going through the ranks and being decorated accordingly in order to have status and influence within the society, the cannonball that shattered his legs is the cannonball that destroyed his dreams. Reflecting on the life of the saints, he began to feel something in his heart. He goes so far as to say this: in reflecting on saints like Francis of Assisi, after his reflections on St. Francis and such saints, Ignatius felt in his heart a sense of warmth, even a sense of happiness, a sense of connection. Oddly enough, this is very, very close to Joseph Smith and the Latter-day Saints. Joseph Smith discerned one can sense the Holy Spirit is in one's heart and influence in one's life if there's a certain sense of inner calm. There's a warmth of feeling. Long before Joseph Smith said that, Ignatius experienced that. And you may have experienced that in your own life, that maybe in the midst of tragedy and upset and confusion and upheaval, there's a warmth in your heart, a certain serenity that's surprising to you. Ignatius does not know what this is. He pursues it. Now, what's important about this is that Ignatius, in pursuing his own pathways, paying attention to his feelings, having the ability to pay attention how, like, the life of Francis or Clare or Dominic can touch him, that became the basis for what will become one of the most ingenious developments in Catholic Church history, the spiritual exercises, that informed the Jesuit community and is a practice for thousands of people, be they Catholic or not, within the world. So when Ignatius put the spiritual exercises together, they did not come from thin air. He was looking at himself. It's much like the AA program. If you read the 12 steps of AA, they're all written in the past tense. Came to believe, came to understand, realize that. Because people who found themselves sober asked the question, how did I get sober? And they looked back and discovered what is now called the 12 steps of AA. At one time, there was 21 steps, or 17 or 16, before it settled on the 12. This was done reflectively. You could do that with your own life. You look back at your life and say, how did I get here? And we're talking about what were those constructive and positive things that happened that brought you to this moment that are discerned through reflection. That is precisely what he's doing. He's looking backwards into his life, paying attention to what he's feeling and noting it, and not quite sure where any of this is going. We could call this discernment. And interestingly enough, there's a Jesuit that you know, Pope Francis, who in his letter on holiness, Gaudete et exultate, rejoice and be glad, in the 5th part of that letter has a wonderful chapter on discernment. He actually says that evil is done away with through the powers of discernment. That what puts evil in perspective is discernment, be it upset, satanic, diabolic, inconvenient. When we stop and ask ourselves the question, what is going on here? Now, since Ignatius was reading the life of the saints, who were the saints following? Who was inspiring the saints? And of course, the person with Jesus. That's why when he names the community, he will name the community the Society of Jesuits, or the Society of Jesus. And people will mock him by saying, Jesuits. They take the name Jesus and just fuse it. It was meant to be mockery. It's interesting that the word that was supposed to mock the community became the signature name of the community, Jesuit. I guess a way for us to understand it would be Jesus freaks, those extremists with Jesus. So when Ignatius is looking at the saints, like Benedict, Scholastica, Augustine, Monica, Francis, Clara, Thomas, he's seeing these saints as windows to the life of Jesus, to the person of Jesus, to the experience of Jesus. So what does he want to do? He wants to go to the Holy Land. But you have to remember, the Holy Land at that time is under Turkish control. And the Western Church and the Eastern world are at war. So it's not like you just go there as a pilgrim. It can be you put your life in danger going there. He succeeded in going there for a number of days, but his dream that he would spend significant amount of time walking in the way of Jesus was never fulfilled. And of course, then that leads to the great question, do you have to go to the Holy Land to meet Jesus? But nonetheless, that was his desire. As a matter of fact, this is what he said in his biography, his autobiography. He wanted to kiss the earth where Jesus walked. If you've ever gone to the Holy Land, it's a tremendous experience when you have a group of people. I've taken about 7 trips of small groups to the Holy Land. And you go to places and you say, this is where we think Jesus proclaimed the Beatitudes. And it's fascinating what people will do if you give them some free time. And you're not going to religious article shops or making announcements, but put some quiet into it. They will go and sit on rocks in the grass or among the flowers and start touching the earth. Wherever they think Jesus touched, whatever they think Jesus walked, they want to follow in the pathways. It's the pathways of the Master. I guess it's like visiting the place where your mother was born. Maybe she was born in a house on 10th Street, and there's a big development going in. And you ask the contractor, do you care if I go into that house before you tear it down? Yeah, go ahead, take your time. And you pick up the spirit of your mother. To touch the place that she touched. He wants to touch the place where Jesus touched. Since he's frustrated that he can't go there, or he went there for short periods of time but had to leave because of conflict and warfare, he would have to imagine what Jesus did, where Jesus was. He would have to envision it. This is going to be crucially important to the spiritual exercise, because that's exactly what you do within the spiritual exercise. You imagine what it was like. You put yourself into the scene. As you know, I come from a place called Pittsburgh, PA. There's a museum there called the Fine Arts Museum of the Carnegie Museums. Way back when I was about 14 years old, I was running around inside that particular institute. And I remember walking up a staircase. It was obscure. And in one of the back walls on the 3rd floor of the institute, I came across a painting. And it was a painting of the Emmaus Gospel, where Jesus was sitting at the table, holding the broken bread And his disciples were at one side mesmerized. But on the other side, there were 4 people, a man, a woman, a boy, and a girl that looked like a family. I paid no attention to it. I was just a little kid. But it made a great impression. Years later, when I was studying scripture, and we came across the Emmaus Gospel in Luke 24, for some odd reason, that old painting came into my head. And now I was intrigued. I get Jesus at the table breaking the bread. I get the disciples being mesmerized. But who are these people on the right side of the painting? Obviously, we're in their house. I went back to the museum. Actually, I flew back home to deliberately go back there and study this painting. And I found out who these people were. It was the artist and his family. He painted himself and his family into the scene. That's exactly what Ignatius is doing in the spiritual exercise. You heard that Jesus was feeding the 5,000. You heard that Jesus was walking on water. You heard that Jesus was preaching the parable of the Samaritan. You heard that Jesus was being crucified. You put yourself into it. There's his vivid imagination. There's his high sense of creativity. His creativity that could have made him a choreographer of dance on the floor makes him a master of the spiritual life in the scripture. What is to be inserted into the text, to imagine, to image out, to feel in every dimension of your senses when Jesus said, the kingdom of God is within you. You have heard it said, but I say to you, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. Let your light shine. Fear not, little flock. It has pleased the Father to give you the kingdom. These were not simply words on a text. They now could be entered into with imagination, sensation. Did you ever imagine something? In the synod we're now in, the church is inviting us to dream. What is your dream for the church of the 3rd millennium? What would you like to see? What would you like to see develop? Come at that with all of your creativity and senses. You can see while it requires exercise, much like one might lift weights, much like one would practice on a musical instrument, to engage the mind, to engage the thought processing, to go deep into the creativity of the moment. He's a frustrated pilgrim. Where his feet can't go, his soul runs. Okay, let's stop, take a deep breath. How are we doing? Any thoughts, any feelings, any questions?
No, just an observation that I've had of how most, if not all, I think all of the people you've introduced so far have come from of high rank, and let all of that go.
Yes.
And it does beg the question, how much of that is how we come to a greater awareness of God's desire for us. But I just find that so interesting. And yeah.
You see it deeply embedded in the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
Go and sell all that you have and come follow me. That's a very, very different gospel than much of what you hear today. Follow Jesus and get money. Follow Jesus and get power. Follow Jesus and get wealth. Follow Jesus and get status, as opposed to forego all of that, not out of spite for the world, but out of love. Or as we'd like to say today, I will live simply, that others may simply live. I will become what I want the world to be. I will live in the ground zeros of life. Or what St. Paul would say, live what you need and no more. Otherwise, what you think you possess possesses you and becomes an obstacle on the pathway. It's not a denunciation of the world. It's a renunciation of those things that would be an obstacle to the radical following of Jesus. Great point. Do we need a little break or should we just keep going?
What do y'all think?
You like a 5-minute break or so? Well,
5
is 5
minutes?
minutes enough or should we come back at 2?
That works.
Why don't we come back at 2? Okay.
All right.
See you
Take
at
a
2 o'clock. I'll
take a
stay right
stretch
here if
break
you
and-
want to talk. Are you going to keep recording or you want to stop the recording?
I'll probably keep recording, just so
And
it's
then-
not 2 separate recordings that I have to send.
Oh, okay, okay. Is this making any sense?
Makes sense to me.
Oh,
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, I love the idea that, he couldn't do a pilgrimage and, instead really immersed himself into scriptures. And that way.
and you can see how the theological insights came up out of the life experience.
Yeah,
It usually happens. Who is the woman in, I was trying to explain to Russ last week, because like Darcy said, most of these saints we're meeting are come from wealth and what have you. And who's the lady in the Bible? And she had the purple cloth. And I think she was the tent maker, but wasn't she wealthy too? And we learned something from her.
Lydia
Yeah.
in the Acts of the Apostles.
And the purple cloth, because isn't purple cloth a signal of wealth in the Bible?
Yes, royalty.
royalty. purple.
Royalty, yeah. And so and she was a tent maker, right?
I believe so. I would have to look it up to be honest with you, but I think so.
I mean, we had to learn something from her. I did ask years ago. I don't remember, I just remember her.
I think one of the problems we have is that we have made a lot of these saints exceptional people and then separated them out as somehow or another they're not indicative of us. They're indicative of some upper echelon of church life. When they're really indicative of us, they are us.
Yeah. I would agree.
We
And
are
I think
them.
just saints in general, I think people thought these, the pictures were usually painted, were so pious. I don't mean physical pictures. I just mean the stories told about them were so overly pious maybe that it seemed unreachable. But I would agree, once you start reading about their lives, it's like not so.
Yeah, the stories encased them
Mhm.
in the very, very kind of casing they were trying to get out of.
Exactly.
Why did Paul VI take sainthood away from some of the apostles? Monica, which you mentioned, from what I understand, she's not a saint anymore. And poor Christopher and Barbara, which is my middle name. What happened to this? Why did he remove
He didn't.
sainthood
There's
from
no
them?
such thing as decanonization. That's a Hollywood thing. You cannot make somebody not a saint anymore.
But he undid them.
No, they were removed from the liturgical calendar
How come?
because
How
there's
can you
too
take
many on the
Christopher?
calendar. There's only 365 days. There's 3,632 saints in 365 days. There are two calendars. There's the Roman calendar, there's the local calendar.
Yeah,
So you have calendars that have, when somebody is removed from the general calendar, that has nothing to do with being removed from sainthood. It means that particular day is predestined. So that's what that is. There is no process, not a saint anymore. It's the process of cleaning up the calendar.
is
Now,
that
what is
done?
a devotion? What is a devotion in one part of the world is not necessarily a devotion in the other part of the world. So the Roman calendar, the general calendar, doesn't tell you what the local feast might be. So, for example, in the Passionist community, we have 12 saints that we honor that are not on the Roman calendar.
Why, does somebody get removed from the calendar every year? I mean, it just seemed like such a big thing when St. Paul, not St. Paul, Pope Paul VI took away like Christopher. How can you take Christopher away?
He didn't take Christopher away. It was removed from the Roman calendar. Doesn't mean it was removed from your calendar. It doesn't mean it was removed from the calendar in the United States. You can go celebrate it if you want. But if you couldn't celebrate all of them if you tried.
Well, every
You'd have-
year, do they all
you'd-
get
you-
rotated every year?
No, nothing. It's the same every year. They're not rotated. That might be a way to solve it, but you might have to go through a whole lifetime to do it once.
But Paul did do something. I mean, he made news. It made news or else.
I know it may not. I'm telling you what, he took them off the calendar.
How many did he take? Do you
I have
know?
no idea. It's not a big deal.
Do you think that people were making more out of that? Is that what you're saying?
Usually, yeah, because used to the no longer a saint. You can't make somebody no longer a saint. You can't revoke baptism. You
Right.
can't revoke ordination. You can't revoke anything. You can't revoke it.
Mhm.
You can't revoke sainthood. There's no such thing in the church. There's no right by which you say, we hereby declare you not a saint.
But we got misled by a wonderful play, Saturday Night Catechism.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
The nun gets up and tells us that Saint Christopher is no longer a saint.
He's Mr. Christopher.
Mr. Christopher, yeah.
now what you
You
might have
wonder how he
is,
picked him. I mean, why did he pick Monica? I mean, how can Santa Monica and
Monica is not removed from the calendar.
No, but
The
he
calendar's crowded.
calendar's crowded.
Monica is not removed from the calendar.
Yeah, I thought that was still a feast day.
It
Or-
is.
Oh,
It
yeah,
isn't but Barbara's removed.
yeah, I haven't seen Barbara. No.
Yeah, Barbara.
Because it's removed from the Roman calendar does not mean it's removed from the calendar. So if you go to Spain, they will have feast days that you don't celebrate. You have feast
Yeah,
days
that's true.
they don't celebrate.
Yeah.
So, devotion to Mary, for example, some countries will have a national holiday is Our Lady of Guadalupe, but in the United States, it's the Immaculate Conception.
Right.
So you don't opt. So the Roman calendar, which is the world's calendar, generally is sparse. But locale, and especially now under Pope Francis and the reforms of canon law, you have influences in the local church that you might not see in other parts of the world. So I have 12 saints that I have devotion to in my order that you may be never heard of.
Father or Darcy.
Yes.
What's going on with regard to the synod in the San Francisco diocese and maybe Darcy, do you know what's going on in this diocese with regard to the synod?
Well, we're still waiting to hear. So yeah, once Father Boney has asked me to hold off on at least doing anything as a group until we know what direction the diocese is asking us to go with it.
Yeah,
Of course, like Father Tom said, you can individually go on,
Yeah.
the Synod website and
and I don't know what San Francisco's doing.
You know, we just recently got our diocesan magazine, and so there is a nice write-up by Bishop Soto about the synod, and he's kind of tried to explain, what's going on with
right.
it and the purpose and what's, going to be happening. And so I thought that was, pretty enlightening.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's already happened in many places. It's already, by the way, you can have small groups of people to come together
Absolutely.
and do the synodal process yourselves and send it straight to the Vatican.
It may happen if we get no direction.
It's a
Thank you.
discernment process. We never did this before, so it's a discernment process.
Good. All right. Back to St. Ignatius.
That's why to go into these different theologies that we've been studying, if you go to the religious orders involved with this, you'll see that they have saints that they have on their calendar that you won't see in your parish calendar. Because that's how it shifts. So, but be careful when you hear things like took off, these absolute kind of things. There's no such process. That's the damage that's done to people. Okay, welcome back. There's a kind of a funny, but it's a sweet kind of thing. Ignatius was in his 40s when he decided to go to school. He received an elementary education as a little boy, but he did not receive the kind of education that was necessary to do philosophy and theology. And so when he was with this lives of the saints and discerning and the processing, he then decided that he wanted to study theology. But in order to study theology, one had to study philosophy. And before one studied philosophy, one had to study letters and grammar and Latin and things like that. So he ended up going back to what we would call elementary school. So here was this grown man sitting in a class with 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12-year-olds, learning with them his letters and his grammar so that he could then do his sophisticated study. And according to his autobiography, he had a very, very difficult time with studies. Now here's someone highly creative, highly ingenious, but can have difficulty with the studies, but mastered it over a period of time. And so you see that. Also, because of his creativity, remember, we're still in the Spanish Inquisition. Because of his creativity and his genius way of envisioning the gospel, he was arrested and imprisoned at least twice. After severe interrogation, he was let go. So this is not somebody who was just walking around in La La Land. His own church, if you will, had him arrested and interrogated. And even that's why if you look at the spiritual exercises, you will see how they profoundly deal with discomfort and upset within the real world. Finally, completely frustrated by the fact that he could not go back to the Holy Land and walking in the ways of Jesus and kiss the soil where Jesus walked, Ignatius and his companions, when they were in higher education, began to form a community called the Society of Jesus. And one of the things they asked for from the Pope was that they would be dedicated to the Pope. So there's a fourth vow in the Jesuit community: chastity, obedience, poverty, and obedience to papal directives. But by papal directives, you don't mean the Pope's slave. You mean that they would be missionaries empowered by the Pope. So Ignatius and Jesuits after that have a special relationship to the Pope, where the Pope may send them to those parts of the world that are in need of higher education, sophisticated education, the pursuit of justice, relief. So there's a special, when you hear the Jesuits take a vow to the Pope, it's not a personal kind of thing that means the Pope's good pleasure, but the Pope precisely as the universal pastor who would then care for the flock. And that's why you see, I believe under Francis, the old Roman tradition of caring for the poor has developed greatly under Francis, who has renovated the finances of the Catholic Church so that the first people served are the destitute of the world. Even the Vatican itself has undergone significant modification and renovation so that it may be of service to the poor and to the broken who live in the street. He would write in the spiritual, actually, he would write in the general directives of the order, hurry to any part of the world where the needs of neighbor summon them. So there's this instinctive sense that the dedication, if you will, to the vow of obedience to the Pope is the willingness to go anywhere in the world to be of service to those who are our neighbor. There are two prayers on page 8 that I would like to share with you. Ignatius prayed, teach us, good Lord, to serve you as you deserve, to give and not count the cost, to fight and not heed the wounds, to toil and not seek for rest, to labor and not ask for reward, except of knowing that we are doing your will. There's that alignment with Christ. For Ignatius, the will of God is not discerned abstractly. The will of God is discerned by profoundly meditating upon the life of Jesus. What he has done, we will do. I think of it this way. Remember at the Lord's Supper in John's Gospel? Jesus says, you call me Lord and Master. I am your Lord and Master. It is right that you call me Lord and Master. But if I, your Lord and Master, wash your feet, what ought you to do one for the other? What I have done, you also must do. So the will of God is not, should I live in Chicago or should I be a plumber? The will of God is always discerned in that alignment and solidarity with the following of Jesus in the real world. Pedro Arupe, who was the general superior of the Jesuit community during the Second Vatican Council, was extremely instrumental in the reform of Jesuit spirituality and the community in light of the council. Remember, in the Second Vatican Council, Jesuits had a major role to play. Two of them you may know, Avery Dulles, who was a cardinal bishop at the time of the council, was instrumental in developing the great ecclesiology, the church's self-understanding. An American, John Courtly Murray, was singularly responsible for the great document of Vatican II on religious freedom. The great American contribution to the Ecumenical Council of Vatican II was the great teachings on religious freedom, where religious freedom was seen as part of the dignity of being a human being and not simply something that was tolerated. No longer would the church tolerate people of different faith communities, but rather was seeing them their fundamental right and their dignity to follow their conscience. That was the great contribution of Courtney Murray and the Jesuit community to Vatican II. Here's the prayer of the General Superior, Pedro Rupe. Grant me, O Lord, to see everything now with new eyes, to discern and test the spirits that help me read the signs of the time, to relish the things that are yours, to communicate them to others. Give me the clarity of understanding that you gave to Ignatius. Side note, pages 12 and 13, if you're so inclined. This is part of an article from the National Catholic Reporter from March 12th, 2014, regarding Pope Francis. When Pope Francis was elected Pope, the Jesuit community cringed. As a priest and a bishop, Pope Francis had the reputation of being stern, insensitive, self-centered, and rigid. His reputation among the Jesuit community was, be careful of him. The old Ignatian flexibility that came from Ignatius certainly wasn't there. When he was elected Pope and smiled and bowed before the people of the world and said, "May I have your blessing," Jesuits who knew him were asking the question, who is this? Where did he come from? Because it happened several years before in the community that Francis was sort of exiled. And they exiled him to a difficult parish where he fell in love with the poor. And Pope Francis considered that his conversion experience. So there's something beloved here. Now the community is extremely proud and blessed of the Jesuit called Pope Francis with the Franciscan title. There you see the genius of the Jesuit of being able to discern the glory of God everywhere. As a matter of fact, that's the motto of the community, for the greater glory of God. Pages 12 and pages 14 and 15. There are 5 summary statements I would like to make. This will be very brief. This is a very beautiful article. It's a reflective article of a person who encountered the Jesuits and is in fact a professor at West Virginia University in West Virginia, Wheeling, West Virginia, a Jesuit school. 5 things about Jesuit spirituality and theology. 1, look for God in everything. Look for God in everything. In the height of the mountain, in the sacredness of the cathedral, and the trash can of life. Look for God everywhere. 2, and this is a difficult one, assume the best possible intention of others. Others may behave in such a way that offend you. But in this kind of spirituality, in this kind of theology, we seek the intention that the other person may not even know that they have. You get rid of reacting and you start responding. It's not an invitation to become a victim. It's an invitation not to become a victim of your own attitude, or to become a victim of your own quick to judgment or quick to condemnation, but to discern and to probe the good intention of another, even if the other doesn't know they have a good intention. 3, to accommodate to the needs and the context of the unique person in front of us. When you meet someone, you don't meet somebody generic, vague, philosophical. You meet a particular person. Accommodate yourself to the needs. Much like if you saw a lovely lady trying to get through a door and she had a cane, you might go and open the door. You accommodate yourself. You accommodate yourself physically, psychologically, and spiritually to the needs of others. 4, present the faith with joy. I love it when people start the better watch out sermon. To present the faith with joy. I think one of the reasons why so many people may not be attracted to a particular faith tradition is that it's presented dismally. One of the practices in Buddha is to smile. Believe it or not, it takes less facial muscles to smile than it does to frown. But frown feels easier to do because we habitually are frowning. So to go feels like strain, no effort. It's not superficial. It's using the word joy. This comes right out of the Bible. Behold, I bring you glad tidings of great joy for all the people. It will bring joy to all the people. I sometimes think there are people more dedicated to proclaiming hell than joy. And joy, of course, in the Bible is interchangeable with the word spirit. One of the symptoms that the Spirit of God is working within you is a joy, not giddiness, but what some might call that serenity of heart. 5, go to the fringes of faith. There you see that obedience to the Pope, especially you see with Pope Francis, who has raised the episcopacy and the consciousness of the church to the edges of the world. We now have bishops from places we never knew even existed, recognizing a church we never even knew was there, to the fringe, to the fringe. You see this in the gospel, go out to the highways and the byways. You see in the Gospel of St. Luke how many times Jesus goes to the edge into the fringe. Finally, by way of conclusion, on page 16, which I had to revise twice, so I hope you have page 16. And thank you, Darcy, for doing that. At the bottom of the page is one of the beloved prayers of Ignatius. This may be the signature prayer of the community. The Suscipe prayer, the Latin for take, Lord. Here's the prayer. In light of everything we said about Ignatius. Take, O Lord, and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, my entire will. Whatever I have or hold, you have given me. I restore it all to you, and surrender it entirely to you to be governed by your will. Give me only your love and your grace. That will be enough for me. Your love and your grace. I am rich enough and ask for nothing more. This is a highly intelligent and creative person. This is someone who found formal education difficult, but achieved it. This is a man who was seeking nobility, who could then learn his ABCs for 12-year-olds. Here's a man who longed to walk in the footsteps of Jesus in the Holy Land and settled being sent to the fringes of the earth to be the presence of Christ. Jesuits are known for their intelligence, their creativity, and their originality. No wonder. They established great universities, sometimes in places you don't expect. And those great universities become centers that oftentimes renovate a city, bring people from the fringes of the earth, create a sense of church within the world. And that's our little mosaic, with all apologies to the dozens more we could have explored. So we have a few minutes. Thoughts, feelings, questions, clarification, any apologies needed?
A very small thing, but some of us will remember Captain Kangaroo. And he told the wee children that a frown took more muscles than a smile.
Mm-hmm. Right out of Buddhism.
That was the captain.
I have a question.
Hi.
My thought is that it's actually probably more of a thought for thought. Do you think Ignatius's experiences with education, which were extensive, had something to do with why and how the Jesuits have developed and founded so many universities?
Yes,
they
I
have.
do.
Yeah.
See, there's an anti-intellectual tradition. If you notice, it's in the United States.
Mhm.
You know, they usually, what happens is people get called, oh, you just wanted an elitist.
Right.
You know, and that's really, really heartbreaking, because intelligence really has little to do with your social status.
For sure.
And I hear something today that still drives me crazy, is get out of your head and into your heart. And my thing is, your head, your heart, and your gut are interconnected. You don't want to get out of one and into the other. You want to visit all three of them. The brain of the gut, the brain of the heart, the brain of the intellect.
Mhm.
But the pursuit of the intelligence, the intellectual, the pursuit for truth is one of the highest capacities of the human person, to know something. Not just to have a bunch of facts that you use as a weapon. That's not intelligence. That's belligerence. But when you're intelligent, you can throw light on a subject. An intelligent person knows when to shut up. A fool keeps talking.
Mhm.
That's why you'll see a brilliant college professor sit down with a 5-year-old and learn how to blow bubbles. That's intelligence.
Mm.
Belligerence is, Oh, let me show you how to do it the right way. So in the intellectual pursuit, it's not like a runaway truck. It's for the greater glory of God and imitating Jesus, who frequently said to his disciples, "So what do you think?"
Mhm.
He would tell a parable that was disarming and say, "Well, what do you think?" We translate, "Listen then, if you have ears to hear with." That may be idiomatic for "what do you think?"
Mhm. Mhm.
How's it striking you? Intelligent people never stop learning.
Father, Father, one of the
Hi.
things that a couple years ago, my son and I went to the movie Pope Francis, Man of His Word. There was hardly anybody in the theater. And I see that it's on Netflix now. But I found that I really learned a lot about Pope Francis from that movie, who he is. And I just find it hard to believe that it's not promoted more in the diocese, or that the churches aren't asked to make that film available. It really lets you know who Pope Francis is.
Mhm.
I have a friend who's not Catholic, who constantly is interested in what Pope Francis is doing and the battles he's the things he has to fight against, and the people who are against him. And she's very, very fond of him. And I think I'm going to recommend that movie to her. But I just don't understand why we don't, that isn't promoted more. And nobody
Well,
seems to know anything about it. It's a very good movie. He's a man of the gospel, really. I mean, it's
Well,
a man who follows the gospel.
I think you just said it. There's a lot of people who are against him.
Mhm.
There's a lot of people who see that the way the church is developing right now is, and of course, it's put in hierarchical understandings and perspective. It's confronting clericalism.
Mhm.
It's looking for consistency of virtue in the bureaucratic life of the church. Financial reform. You want enemies? Reform finances.
Mhm. Mhm.
You really want enemies? Direct wealth to the poor.
Right. Well, the first thing we saw him do, wasn't it? The first thing practically he did after he was made Pope was go and wash the feet of the prisoners in Rome, in some prison in Rome.
Yeah.
It might have been right about the time of Easter. Easter
Yeah,
time.
he even washed the feet of women.
Mhm.
And I was silenced for washing the feet of women.
Oh, boy.
So it's not like I felt revenge. What I felt was, thank you. It was a moment of great gratitude. But remember, the first thing that he did was to bow down before the people of Rome and the world and ask for a blessing.
Blessing. Yes, yes.
I remember I was driving on 160 by the Sacramento River when that moment happened, and I almost drove the car into the river.
Yeah.
I literally had to pull off to the side and say, this is a stunning moment in the church's life.
Mhm.
The Vatican officials were ready to go crazy.
You can imagine.
And then he wasn't supposed to speak, and he did.
Mhm.
And he asked for prayer. Instead, we do this together. He put that whole sense, I am not the emperor, that sense of pastor. And that comes out of that Ignatian vow. Here's the Pope being obedient to the Pope. Is the Pope being obedient to the papacy, which is pastor.
Mhm.
Pastor. Remember, the word pontiff means bridge builder. When you say Pope, that's an abbreviation for the word pontifex. Pontiff, which means to build the bridge.
Interesting.
Mhm.
So the Jesuit vow of obedience to the Pope is as universal pastor. And the pastor, of course, takes the image from Christ, the Good Shepherd.
Right. Okay.
And they're very often an imaginative, creative. My sheep know me and I know them.
Mhm.
Thank you for bringing that up.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you.
Have you ever brought that movie to St. Peter and Paul, Darcy?
I have not, but that's it's a possibility for sure. It is a very good movie. Yeah, I enjoyed it. Yeah, I haven't had any movie night or in any movie events in a couple of years anyway. So, but yeah, it would be a good one to make available for sure.
Well, thank you, everyone. It was great to be with you. I hope our little series with the blessing to you was a wonderful excursion for me to learn a few things to share with you. We do this together, and I look forward to listening to that great symphony of women through the history.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you,
Thank
Father.
Very,
you,
very
Father.
much.
Very
Great
much.
series.
Yes,
Thank you.
thank you.
Excellent.
Very good. And I would say that you seriously model the best of all of those traditions. As I was listening, I thought,
Mhm.
he's got a little bit of all of them in him. But I think
Very
that that's the beauty of the Mosaic, right? That
Oh,
there's beautiful aspects that we can all incorporate. But thank you very much for doing that.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you,
Yeah.
Darcy, for bringing us together.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And
Thank
we
you,
look
Heather.
forward to seeing you in March. If you logged on late, March 9th, 16th, 23rd, and 30th in the afternoon, same time, 1 to 2:30. We'll be once again with Father Tom.
Great.
So thank you. If we
Okay.
don't see you before then, have a blessed Thanksgiving and Christmas and all of that.
Thank you.
It's upon us.
Thank you,
Be
Father.
well.
Thank you.
Take care.
we will. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.